Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the start of another week. And we are, apart from one show tomorrow evening, we're on the Eastern Front again. This is the third dedicated Eastern Front week we have done, and they're always popular. We've had a new batch of subscribers over the last few days, so that's great. So if you've just found us, and a few people from the comments have just found us, maybe that was Sophie Lyne's show, maybe it was one of Falay's. Well, welcome to the channel. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing so you get the notifications of the forthcoming shows. Consider perhaps becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member. And as always, all the information you need is in the description below on YouTube. So the links to the World War II TV resources and that of our guests. And my guest today, Prit Buttar, is back for his, I don't know whether it's fifth or sixth appearance, something like that. His latest book, Meat Grinder, I'm holding up here, is what we are talking about today. It's the summer of 42 through to the spring of 1943, when, as you know, if you know anything about the Eastern Front, that's the Stalingrad period. And we will be doing a week or two on the Stalingrad battles at the end of this year, or possibly into January next year. But there's a lot more to the Eastern Front than what was happening in the Stalingrad area. So that's what we're going to find out today. This will connect with a couple of other shows Prit has done with us. So they are linked in the description below. If you enjoy this one, go back and watch the previous shows. But I'm going to bring my guest in now. So Prit Buttar up in Bonnie, Scotland. So how are you today, Prit?
I'm very well indeed, and very, very happy to be back.
So, as I said there, you know, the focus on the Eastern Front tends to be on the well-known campaigns, Leningrad, which I know you're working on at the moment, and then, of course, the Battle for Moscow, and notably Stalingrad. And, you know, my own bookshelves have, I think, 5 books with Stalingrad in the title, if not more than that. But there's a lot more going on. So, you know, when you're trying to come up with a new book, and obviously the Eastern Front, there's an unlimited mine of subjects you can discuss there. What is it that you think was interesting about this sector, that why we should know more about what we're going to be talking about today?
I think part of the secret of unlocking what goes on the Eastern Front is to understand how much the narrative was determined both by Germans writing their memoirs after the war and the way in which the Soviet Union modified the historical record to try to claim, you know, almost infallible foresight on the part of people like Stalin and Zhukov. And trying to unpick all of that makes you realize that actually there was just endless muddle and confusion, as indeed there was on most sectors of the Second World War, with both sides making enormous mistakes and sometimes getting away with it and sometimes not. You can make a very seductive narrative about the master plan to draw the Germans into a killing ground in Stalingrad with exposed flanks and then isolating them and enveloping them. But actually, when you look at the way the battles unfolded, so much just happened by chance. And this is a good point of discussion here, because we're going to talk about battles that were enormously bloody and every bit as large scale as the conflicts further south, the better known ones, and yet they've been airbrushed out of history because it was very difficult to fit them into the narrative. And when they were fitted into the narrative, it's such an awkward fit that it's just glaringly obvious that actually this isn't really the truth.
Well, absolutely. And as we often sort of talk on this channel, whether it's the Pacific Theatre, the Mediterranean or the Eastern Front, the 42 into 43 is the period when things are changing and swinging. The pendulum is swinging back and forth in North Africa and mid-Pacific, and things could have gone different ways in that. But by the time, as you say, you get to the latter part of the war, when the Soviets are writing their own history and they're starting to write the propaganda version, when the victory is more likely, it gets a little bit more clear cut, and that's where we get all these legends. But yes, that middle part of the war is probably the most intriguing, because it's that bit that's ignored. But we'll bring up the PowerPoint, and you've come with a nice number of maps. But folks who like maps, we'll go into there, and we'll start with this overview one. And what we'll do today, we'll do little comments as we go along, folks, and at the end of it, we'll do any kind of bigger questions about the Eastern Front generally. So we'll just kind of plod along that way. But Give us a breakdown of, and actually starting, this map is from November to March, but we're starting a bit earlier than that. But kind of give us a rundown of where the front is, in the summer of 1942.
So actually, the circled area around the salient to the west of Moscow is slightly wrong for November 42. The German bulge into the western side of that salient was eliminated in the early summer of 42 in an operation codenamed Seydlitz, which resulted in another Soviet army being effectively destroyed. But it's a very useful map because it shows you this enormous salient thrust, that's been left over from the winter fighting. And it's pretty much where the front lines froze at the end of the Soviet counteroffensive. Moscow is still, theoretically at least, within range of that salient. But, you look at that salient, even with the little side bulge taken out, and on a map at least, just look at it. That absolutely invites a pincer attack, doesn't it? You just look at that and you think that's asking for trouble to have a salient like that pointing, north-northeast. What the map, though, doesn't really show you is that little stretch of land to the west of the salient, between the western side of the salient and the German lines in front of the Baltic states, that area is actually crossed by remarkably few roads. There are very few roads and lines of communication there. And in fact, because of the orientation of the railways, the Red Army found it actually very difficult to concentrate forces within that area. So although the salient looks tempting, it's actually quite hard to build up forces on the west side of it in order to mount a pincer attack. And yet, as we will see, for all sorts of reasons, the Soviet planners just completely ignored the reality on the ground and repeatedly fell into the track into the trap of looking at a map and just thinking, oh my goodness, look at this, we can do X or Y. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail. So if we move on to the next map, this is where the salient was by the summer. So you can see here that bulge, which would have been coming in from the left-hand side here, has disappeared now. And the Germans have a continuous front line around this salient. In a previous someone's just asked about the main Rollbahn. You can see that towards the bottom of this map, Andreas. Starting, if you go to the bottom of the map, running diagonally from slightly higher on the east, running down towards the west, you can see the main highway that would have carried on all the way up to Moscow. And of course, you can see Smolensk right on the left-hand side of the map. And again, in theory, this looks really, really tempting. For the Red Army, we could move against Smolensk and start cutting their lines of supply. But you can't really do that because it's difficult to concentrate forces in that area north of Smolensk. Yeah, there is a second, if you like, the main highway is the Varshavskoye highway at the bottom. There is a second, also a fairly important route running from Smolensk up through Vyazma in the center of the map and on to Moscow. So those are the two main routes. Now, in a previous show, Paul and I talked about the Vyazma airborne operation, which resulted in about 30,000 paratroopers and cavalry operating in the Vyazma area. And at the time, Zhukov wanted to mount an armored offensive from the bottom right-hand corner of this map to link up with them and then push on towards Smolensk in order to slice off the bottom of the salient. This plan was actually abandoned in midsummer, largely because of the disaster that befell the Red Army at Kharkov, where Voroshilov's counterattack ran straight into the Wehrmacht, preparing for its advance towards Stalingrad. And the destruction of Soviet armor was so great there that many of the tank units that Zhukov had planned to use in this renewed drive were then diverted off down south. So he had to abandon this strike from the south. And instead, he came up with a different plan, which involved an attack against the upper right-hand part of this salient, where from the north, Kalinin front was to attack directly towards Rzhev. and from the upper right, so from the northeast, Western Front would strike towards Sychevka and the railway line running down towards Vyazma. And this plan was originally codenamed Sverdlovsk, and here is an example of the unreliability of memoirs. Zhukov kind of makes out that this was Stalin's idea and it originated with Stavka. It would appear that that is more than a little bit disingenuous, because Stavka by now had already issued instructions after the somewhat shambolic end of the winter campaign, saying, look, we can't have so many offensive operations going on at the same time. It's a diversion of strength, and we end up wasting our resources on a huge scale. It's much better to concentrate all our resources in one major action. And yet, here we are, we're coming towards August, and there are plans being drawn up for a major two-front offensive here in the central sector.
When you say offensive, Prit, we're not talking about anything big enough to push the Germans back to Berlin yet. It's still about kind of stabilizing and pushing trying to organize the line more, isn't it? I mean, by 42, the Soviets just haven't got the personnel, the armaments yet for anything major. That just months earlier they've been backs against the wall. So by offensive, it's sort of still containment in some ways.
Well, yes, it's not an offensive in the sense of there is a strategic or a major operational objective that is within striking range, but it's an offensive where, if this goes well, we can certainly smash up and conceivably destroy Ninth Army. And that in itself is an end, even if we're still left with the Wehrmacht deep inside the Soviet Union. We've knocked out a third of Army Group Center. That in itself is a very valuable thing, And when you're fighting, when you've been driven back most of the way to Moscow, actually there aren't very many strategic sort of geographical objectives within easy reach, and you're going to have to content yourself with just biting off chunks of German-held ground and destroying German forces in order to do this. So yeah, it isn't even like in the aftermath of Stalingrad, where there were options where, if we can reach the coast of the Sea of Azov, or even further west, if we can strike towards the Dnieper or reach the Black Sea, we can pin the Wehrmacht against the seas to the south and destroy them. There aren't those options in Army Group Center. There is just this enormous salient which is almost crying out for a pincer. Someone's got to go after this salient. And besides which, look, we can prevent the Germans from ever attacking Moscow again. So this is so juicy, and yet this is the most inappropriate ground on which to conduct a major operation. There are very few roads, and most of the main roads are actually under German control. It's very difficult for the Soviets to concentrate their forces around this salient, and to make matters even worse, Zhukov and Konev, who was commanding Kalinin Front at the time, they both grew up in this area. So they know the landscape. They have no excuse. And yet Zhukov seems to get sucked into seeing the world the way it looks on a map. And he thinks, well, look, come on. We nearly took Rzhev in the winter fighting. Surely we can go after that. We can cut the railway line to Sychevka. And even while they're drawing up plans for what became known as the Rzhev-Sychevka operation, he was already planning a follow-on offensive which would have rolled the attack onto the south, down that Varshavskoye highway, through Smolensk, etc., and just sort of almost trying to reverse the events of the previous year. And part of the problem here is that everybody was still mesmerized by the speed at which the Wehrmacht had moved through this area in 1941. So that kind of sets everybody's expectations to, well, if the Germans can do it, anyone can, we can do it too. Except the Wehrmacht was chasing a defeated Red Army at the time. It's very, very different doing it against, forces in a deliberately defensive posture with plenty of time to dig in. And remember, the Germans, apart from eliminating that salient, on the western side of this bigger salient, the Germans have been in these positions now since the end of the winter fighting. And like infantry in any army, you can guarantee their staff sergeants have had them digging in every single day and digging deeper and making their positions stronger. So this is actually now a very formidable position.
Brilliant. Are we moving on to the next map?
Yeah, so here we are. This is the battle that gets Model's reputation as a great defensive commander. But it's worth pointing out that at the end of July 1942, he wasn't actually on the Eastern Front. He had been flying over the front lines in a Storch aircraft, and he had taken a bullet through his chest. He had a collapsed lung. He was saved by the medics of the Panzer Division, which he was visiting. His pilot was lucky to get the plane down. He had been hit too. Think about how different history had been if the bullet had just gone a little bit to one side in either of their cases. So he was away, and in his absence, Fietinghoff is actually commanding 9th Army. Now, again, regular listeners will know that I actually have a bit of a problem with some of the reputations of some of the German commanders, particularly people like Manstein. And actually, I have kind of a problem with Model's reputation too, because although this battle, as you will see, turns into this great defensive success, it's not as if the general, the commanding general of 9th Army is intervening very much. Basically, the Germans are doing what they traditionally do. They have maybe 3/4 of their forces up front. Each of the divisions and each of the corps has maybe 1/4 of their forces held in hand for the inevitable German counterattacks. They've planned their defensive fields of fire carefully, and they just execute their plan exactly as per German textbook. There is no clever generalship involved. Model's main contribution is he has good credit with the Führer, so he is able to prevail upon Hitler to provide reinforcements, etc. Whenever he, when he says, "Mate, I need reinforcements," Hitler tends to listen.
Well, we've got a couple of questions or comments there. The History Explorer is saying the issue with attacking a salient, Prit, is you gift internal lines to the defender. They seldom work out as anticipated. In the map we're looking at now and the previous one, you can kind of see that circle being pressed with a sort of central hub in the middle there. You're just, the more you squeeze on it, the more they can, their defenses become tighter. So I think we can see that ourselves. Grant is mentioning, no, that's not the one I wanted to put up. Yeah, here we go. How much does bad Soviet intelligence play in this? Namely, belief the German army could still attack with 2 army groups, center and south. So, we like to always talk about intelligence generally, because again, a lot of our references come from the latter part of the war when all sides and in all theaters have better intelligence. But it's 42 again, isn't it? So yes. Does that have a factor?
Well, there was a great German deception operation in summer 42 to persuade the Red Army and persuade Stalin that they were going to strike again in the central sector. They issued detailed maps of parts of Moscow, etc., right down to regiment level. Stalin himself was quite convinced that actually there would be a resumption of fighting on the Central Front. He held back substantial reserves even after Army Group South broke out across the Donetsk and headed for the Don and eventually the Volga. And actually those reserves persisted in the central area for a long time. How much it was a failure of Soviet intelligence and how much it was Stalin over-reliant upon his own intuition, well, that's a separate discussion, and we could go down that rabbit hole at great length if we wanted to,
I mean, I was also thinking that, I mean, in some ways, it would be, I'm going down another rabbit hole of my own. It would almost benefit, given how well dug in, is for the Germans to mount their own renewed attempt for Moscow. Let them come out of their positions, and then the Soviets encircle them as they come out. But in the end, the Soviets are moving into these prepared positions they've been in for months. So if you're doing that, you've got to be confident of your numerical superiority or your tactical superiority, wherever it would be, because dug in positions, whichever theater it's in, are always going to be a tough nut.
Well, that's absolutely correct. But at this point, the additional factor is that the Red Army simply doesn't have the expertise to risk getting drawn into encounter battles
Right.
with the panzer divisions, who are damn good at that, and they're going to cut you to pieces. Given that, even if they were outnumbered, you would expect a panzer division to be able to take on a tank corps in an encounter battle and run rings around it. So there is. Yes, on the face of it, it's tempting to say we'll invite them to attack us. But actually, at this point, the Red Army really wasn't keen on giving the Germans any initiative at all.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so this operation that finally commences on the 30th of July with 30th Army, which is the one immediately north of Rzhev there, attacking towards the city. By now, the Red Army is getting pretty good at preliminary bombardments. They're building up the strength of their artillery units. They have dedicated artillery brigades and even divisions that are assigned to armies in order to help them achieve a breakthrough. But although the bombardment crushes the first line of trenches and the Red Army advances, and on the first day, it actually gained about 4 miles and pushed most of the way to that village called Polonino, due north of Rzhev. Thereafter, the advance ground to a halt. And part of this was because the Germans had prepared multiple lines of defense. Part of it was that the Red Army actually found it very, very difficult to move its artillery forward because the ground was very unsuitable. So there were lots of factors involved there that just made this actually very, very hard for them to maintain momentum. And aware that we really mustn't let the Germans settle. We've got to keep on hitting them. Konyev was urging his rifle divisions just to keep up the attack, even though the artillery wasn't keeping up with them. So at this point, losses start to rise at a catastrophic rate. So yes, initial success. We've knocked them out of their front line. We've pushed into their defences, but you haven't actually broken through the defence line. And thereafter, the Germans really start hitting back. They start bringing troops up that railway line. At this point, 6th Infantry Division, you can see sitting there near Sychevka. It had been pulled out of line north of Rzhev for a rest period. It had just about got to Sychevka and taken up its rest positions when it was put on trains and sent straight back again. But again, look at that. They're going up that railway line. And just looking at that map, that railway line is such an obvious point of, it's an obvious line of resupply. It's a German arterial route to keep the defense alive. And yet, the Soviet Air Force made little attempt to mount a systematic attack on that railway line. You can't imagine the Germans missing an opportunity like that. They'd have bombed that railway line to bits. They'd have had aircraft flying up and down it to attack targets of opportunity. The Soviet aviation did very, very little by way of that. So the Germans succeed in moving an entire infantry division up that railway almost unmolested.
Wow.
Which is, you're just sort of like thinking, how on earth, do you end up in that sort of position? Meanwhile, the weather, as was often the case in the Second World War, now started turning against the Red Army. So here is an account by Klebnikov, who was Kalinin Front's artillery chief. And he later wrote, he said, "Those who attacked in the lowlands and swamps near Rzhev will never forget those days. Water poured down from the heavens in torrents and welled up from below, instantly filling freshly dug trenches. The infantry moved forward in mist and damp. Their feet were bogged down so firmly in the black liquid mess that it felt as if claws were gripping their boots. The gunners harnessed a dozen horses to pull a single light 76mm gun free, but to no avail. The horses sank up to their bellies in mud and had to be hauled out with ropes. The mud was our main enemy and cost us time and again just to gain every single meter." So,
Wow.
the lack of proper roads is now counting heavily against the Red Army. They've chosen to attack in country that has, dense forests. This is a very swampy region. These rivers weren't sort of they weren't managed in the way that they would have been in Western Europe, with carefully tailored banks and drainage sorted out or whatever. They were all prone to flooding. This was a very, very swampy and damp area, and now it starts to rain, and it's just not going to go well.
I mean, why did they choose that area? I mean, because when you get that map with the salient there, this is the Soviets choosing exactly where to attack. So they must have there must have been a benefit to it. They had a reason for it, clearly. Or am I missing something? I mean, clearly, if they do get there, they could then maybe use the railway line themselves to move south. It is a transport hub, but you said Zhukov is from this area. There has to be a reason why they chose that area to attack on.
Well, this is the problem, because when you read the memoirs and the official accounts, they are so distorted. And it's very hard to, on the face of it, it just looks a bafflingly stupid decision to attack over this ground. I think the only explanation I can really offer is that Zhukov's original plan was to strike further south. But he had to abandon that because he didn't get the tanks that he wanted, because they had been sent south to fill the gaps left after Voroshilov's disaster at Kharkov. He had probably planned this attack against the northern part of the salient to take place while he was unleashing his main armored forces further south.
Right.
So this attack was probably intended to pin the Germans in their positions and stop them diverting forces down south. So then when you abandon the attack in the south, you've already started a build up in the north. So you're kind of left thinking, well, let's give it a go anyway. I mean, that's really I know it sounds like a rubbish explanation, but frankly, I'm struggling to come up with anything else. This is. And
if you've spent 2 years working on a big book, this thickness, and you still haven't quite worked out why, it does say something. I'm not quite sure what it says, but it says something.
It was a bad decision, whichever way you look at it, particularly going up against an enemy who is in deliberately defensive posture. They've had time to dig in. They've been doing this for ages, So anyway, the northern attack grinds to a halt some distance short of Kiev, of Rzhev. Then Western Front attacks. It succeeds at first, and the village in the upper right, Pogorilo-Gorodishche, falls on the first day of Western Front's offensive. The German 161st Infantry Division is actually thrown back in considerable disarray, and at this stage, it looks like things are not going badly at all. We're making headway. So if we go on to the next map,
that immediately looks like something's happened. There's a westward facing bulge there, and that's looking better.
Exactly. So Western Front has now pushed on from Pogorilo-Gorodishche. They've reached and crossed the Vazuza River in places, and the Germans have now brought 3 panzer divisions into line here and 78th Infantry Division in the south. Note in the north, there is now almost no further progress. So Kalinin Front has ground to a halt some distance short of Rzhev. They're busy shelling the city, they're bombing it, etc., but they're not really advancing. But now it's Western Front's turn to encounter exactly the same problems. It's really difficult to move your artillery forward through this terrain. It's crisscrossed with lots of ravines, heavily forested. There aren't any decent roads running in the right direction, and it's really, really hard work to advance. So you have here a cavalry corps that has pushed on ahead in order to try to exploit. The 3 panzer divisions you can see here had been earmarked for a German operation further south. It was one of these front straightening operations in order to pinch off and destroy a previous Soviet penetration. That was curtailed. The divisions were put on railways, dispatched up to the north as quickly as they possibly could in order to take over this area. So they arrived just in the nick of time, and because of the developing crisis with 161st driven back in considerable disarray, 5th and 1st Panzer Divisions get fed into the battle somewhat piecemeal. Panzer Division commanders hate this. They want to keep their division together, but the situation is what it is. You just got to throw troops in wherever you can to try to shore up the defensive line. And we end up with terrible fighting as a result, with neither side able to concentrate enough to make a really decisive difference. Meanwhile, Zhukov has now been appointed Deputy Supreme Commander. Okay, so he now disappears from the scene, and or rather, he is certainly distracted with his other duties. So now this battle starts to assume kind of a life of its own. This is a little bit like some of those awful slugging matches that were, typical of the fighting in Flanders in the First World War, where it just assumes a momentum all of its own. You just carry on attacking because that's what you've been doing, and you grind on and you grind on, because actually no one has the courage to say, we need to stop doing this, and so the battle just continues. It's actually very hard for the Red Army to bring forward its second echelon to try to exploit the gains of Western Front. And in the meantime, these three panzer divisions are bringing up further forces. They're beginning to concentrate. And I have an account here of 5th Panzer moving up from the south in order to take up defensive positions here. And this is from the Panzer Regiment, one of the veterans, who wrote, the battalion was to stand ready for an attack towards Zibtsov, either side of the main road. The battalion prepared for an attack with one company forward and the rest in and south of Gorshkova. During these preparations, Russian artillery struck the northern end of the village just before the advance had properly begun. Then the call came, enemy tanks up ahead. T-34s drove into the village from the north. So then they have to deal with these with their Panzer IIIs, which by now, let's face it, are completely outgunned by the T-34. But they do what they can. They knock it out at point-blank range. Battalion commander, Major Seidenstick, arrived from the south. He ordered the first company to thrust north under heavy fire from Soviet tanks. Another company was ordered to protect the right flank. And they set off up this road, and the account goes on describing just this attritional fight as they were trying to fight their way up. And in fact, as you can see on this map, by the time you get to 7th of August, they have actually restored the line along that along that route towards Zibtsov, and therefore restored communications from the south. But this battle is now turning into this appalling attritional battle. And if we go on to the next picture, you can see a scene that would have been much more familiar to the fathers of these guys from the First World War. This muddy, filthy trench, a machine gun on the parapet, covering the Soviet lines. And these were the conditions that both sides endured. This guy is trying to shovel deeper, trying to dig in a little bit better, because it's just turning into this awful, awful slugging match with losses just rising on both sides for no particular gain at all. So in order to try to break the deadlock, Western Front now sent its second echelon into action, which was the 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps. And here is an account from one of the soldiers in 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps. And he said, we moved up to Pogorelo Gorodishche. We were on high ground overlooking it. We were in the forest, and then the Germans flew over and bombed the trains in the railway station. We left our horses in the forest, and I never saw them again. We walked through the forest and moved to the Vazuza River as part of the 2nd echelon. The entire bank was dug up with trenches to protect against bombing. German planes arrived every morning between 7 and 8. The Junkers, we could just call them bastards, but their intelligence had apparently alerted them that our echelon was moving up, and they bombed us every day. And we asked ourselves, where are Stalin's Falcons? This was the nickname given to Soviet fighter units. We never saw them. 2 ground attack aircraft appeared one time, and one was immediately shot down by the Germans and crashed near us. The pilot was probably killed. Then we attacked and took a village. We had to go further and were concentrated in a ravine, waiting for the command to attack. And then it was forwards, and the Germans had already aimed their guns at the ground ahead of us. As soon as we jumped out, they began to bombard us with mortars. If it hadn't been for my helmet, I'd have died as a splinter pierced the helmet and got stuck in my temple. I fell, and the orderlies dragged me back into the ravine and bandaged me. They took us, me and another soldier, to the medical battalion. On the way, I saw 2 Katyusha launchers standing in a ravine. They fired a volley, maybe at the village we were attacking. But after firing their volley, they immediately turned around and left because the Germans had good radio intelligence and quickly spotted where they were shooting from and would shell that spot. So this is just, degenerating into this awful slugging match, and they're really just getting absolutely nowhere. So if we carry on with the slides, the next one is an example of the attempts by the Red Army to move its forces forward. So here you have these small wooden boats being used to bring forward infantry because there are just no roads. And this is, a desperate attempt to move these guys up. Ian comments, sounds like Luftwaffe still had basic air superiority. It's really important to remember that right the way through towards the, really quite late on in the war, the Luftwaffe was able to achieve local air superiority on various sectors of the Eastern Front, even though overall it was outnumbered. And here, certainly, they were in almost pretty much complete control of the air, and they were just dominating it. The weather continued to be utterly awful. It was just every bit as terrible as you'd expect it to be. On the 8th of August, there was a major development. It was the return of Model. He arrived back at the front line. He immediately did a typical Model thing. He ordered all of the units to mobilize their rear area units to comb them out, organize alarm units that could reinforce the front line. And you can just see this awful, squalid mess. If you go back to the previous picture, for me, this absolutely sums up the utter misery and the desperation of the fighting in this salient through that awful summer. I mean, the anguish on this guy's face as he runs through that soaking wet trench, and he has to fight in this condition. He has to live in this condition, surrounded by the corpses of both sides. You just shudder to think of how these people on both sides endured these awful, awful conditions. It must have been absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to make this sort of point about, we had, John Buckley on last week talking about the Allies in Normandy and their doctrinal approach to using armor and infantry and artillery combined. And I'm thinking it's just pointless asking these kind of questions because this terrain, these conditions, the nature of this battle doesn't lend itself to this. This is just low level, almost no idea what you're doing. But there's no, if you're having to move, let's go back to that photo of the moving infantry up by, that kind of, if that's how you're getting your infantry to the front, that's not conducive to organizing a coordinated combined arms assault using all your asset. This is, it's First World War, kind of running at each other in like kids in a playground almost, except a horrible, awful, muddy, deadly playground.
It's absolutely crazy, isn't it? And yet this is the way they had to try to fight on. And this was the time when the battle became known as the meat grinder, because these soldiers just knew that the units were just getting chewed up in front of them as they went forward. And, the Germans were, their losses were accumulating. Model had, as I say, organized the rear area units into the front line. He sent a message to Hitler saying, unless I get reinforcements, I'm going to run out of men. And Hitler authorized the release of 78th Infantry Division, which now arrived to join the front line. And so it continued. Meanwhile, here is an account of a Red Army division going into action. This is by a man called Gorbaczewski, and he was, sorry, I'm just looking for my wee notes to see if I can find the right page. He describes how his division, which had been made up largely of new recruits, was thrown into a renewed attempt to attack from the north. I can't find the reference here, but it's in my book if people wanted to get out and read it. he describes, they waited, there were initial bombardment, and it was very impressive, this curtain of artillery shells that descended on the Soviet lines, massive fire, and then they rose up and went forward. They struggled through the barbed wire, they struggled through the some of the German obstacles that hadn't been broken, and watched slightly worried as the tanks that were accompanying them just motored away into the depths of the German position. Suddenly they came under increasingly heavy fire themselves, to the point where they started taking enormous losses, and eventually they ended up back in their start line. And he describes how when they returned to where they had started from, the company chef had prepared a meal for all of the men, and there were something like 19 men left to eat this meal, and he was inconsolable that so many of the men he had cooked for had died. But the account is really useful because it summarizes everything that was wrong about Soviet combined arms warfare at this stage. Namely, there was nothing combined about it. So you have this visually impressive artillery fire, and yet the German defenses are manifestly not suppressed. The obstacles haven't been crushed. The tanks move forward. They're buttoned down. They have no real situational awareness. They certainly don't realize they're leaving the infantry behind, and they just press on into the depths of the position where the Germans are waiting for them. Because without infantry, they're easy to pick off, and they are destroyed, with relative ease. And the Red Army finds itself back where it started. It just shows just how much the Soviets still had to learn at this stage.
And in this part of the summer, and we're now moving into the autumn and the winter of 42, the last thing the Soviets need in this front is an attritional campaign, given what's happening 800 miles south, east in Stalingrad. They want something to be resolved fairly quickly and then stabilize again. So this kind of just grudging, wearing down campaign is of no benefit to the Soviets or indeed the Germans at this point. It's just, as you say, it's a meat grinder for those in it, with no side really achieving anything except misery.
Exactly. So eventually in September, the fighting ground to a halt, largely because Konev had now been appointed to oversee the entire operation, and he decided this was going nowhere, so he pulled the plug on it. By now, 9th Army had suffered about 45,000 dead and wounded. Soviet losses were at least 185,000. So 4 times as great, possibly even higher. I mean, just an extraordinary number of casualties on both sides, really. So we then have a lull through September. And if we go on to the next map, so here we are in early November. And again, now we get to the point of really, really unreliable memoirs, because if you read Zhukov's memoirs, what came later on, Operation Mars, he describes how the planning for this began actually quite late in the day. So he's talking about late October, early November. And yet we have warning orders being sent to both Kalinin and Western Fronts, codenamed Mars, at the beginning of October. So someone's being kind of economical with the truth here. And my own suspicion very strongly is it's our man Zhukov, because he was the one who then said, let's launch another major attack here. So, we've failed here already. We failed with the airborne operation around Vyazma. We have now thrown away nearly 200,000 men in this enormous attack in the summer. So let's do it again in the winter, because hey, if we, the Germans will never think we're going to attack here again. After all,
this is the Blackadder bit, isn't it? We'll do exactly the same thing we've done before, because they'll never expect it in the same place exactly the same way. Yeah,
it just defies logic, and yet. The Germans are sitting there monitoring Soviet radio traffic, and they're picking up Soviet radio signals to the partisans saying there's going to be an offensive on the 25th of November. They know absolutely when the Red Army is coming. So, on this occasion, our man Model doesn't really have to do much. His men are just digging ever deeper, and they're preparing their defenses, and they're getting ready, for further fighting. So The actual details of what was intended with Mars coinciding with the operations around Stalingrad is something that remains very controversial to this day. David Glantz goes down the route of saying this was a disastrous defeat and it was Zhukov's biggest catastrophe. Others, Anthony Beaver, for example, tends to take the line of thought that this served as a diversion from what's happening in the south. Well, I'm not, I'm not convinced by that line of argument. And one of the keys to this is that throughout both Operation Uranus, which is the encirclement of Stalingrad, and Operation Mars, there are two Soviet armies. There is a tank army and there is a Guards army sitting near Moscow. Now, why are they there? You have to ask yourself, why is Stalin keeping this large group handy in that area? Later on, as we will see, Zhukov was desperate to have those released for him to use here. They ended up being sent south because the fighting around Stalingrad was tying down too many Soviet forces and the Red Army needed reinforcements there. The only conclusion I can come to is that these operations were both conceived at the same time. And if you like, the thinking at Stavka was, well, we could get lucky. They could both succeed, in which case we can use the reserves where we want. If only one of them succeeds, we can send the reserves to that sector. But we're going to have two operations, so we can wait and see what happens here. Yeah, on this map, I've only displayed corps level German units rather than divisions because the map just became too cluttered if I put all the divisions on there. So sorry about that. It just made more sense.
And have the Germans move more people in this? During this time frame, and indeed have the Soviets move more people in? I mean, I know there was this lull bit, in September, October.
Well, the Soviets have indeed brought up fresh troops, and they tended to replace entire divisions and later rifle corps in these armies. So the armies themselves may have moved, but actually they were just brought up to strength with huge drafts. The Germans had moved at least one corps headquarters into this area. A lot of the troops that had been brought up here to deal with the summer fighting were still in this area. And in addition, Grossdeutschland was now up in this area. Up in the top left-hand corner of the salient near Olenino. So they're also up in this area. But the point here is we have Uranus unfolding in the south. We have the pincers closing in around 6th Army. And then on the 25th of November, the artillery opens up in this sector. And we have a whole new offensive opening up here. Now, why do you attack here again? Well, the ground is no better than it was before, and in fact, it's probably going to be worse because it's snowing heavily. There's roads are much harder to find. Okay, the rivers may be frozen. Big deal. It's not really going to make for much improved mobility. Again, the only explanation I can really offer you is that perhaps Zhukov's thinking was, if we can break through and destroy the salient, then the slaughter of the summer gains some meaning because we can say we couldn't have won this winter victory if we hadn't weakened the Germans first. But other than that, to my mind, if you were going to launch an offensive in parallel with Uranus, surely the axis would have been further south nearer Vyazma, where the main roads, the main highways are. Where the ground is more open, there isn't quite as much dense forest, so you can maneuver much more easily. But no, we're going to go into action again here. So if we go on to the next map now, we're going to deal with this side of the salient first. In all, there were 4 attacks on the salient. This is the attack from the west. There was a matching attack, which we will show this is the attack from the east. There was a matching attack from the west, which was meant to meet up with it. And at the same time, there was an attack from the very top of the salient to strike west of Rzhev, so in the top left-hand corner of this map. And there was a 4th attack further to the northwest to advance along that railway line that approaches Rzhev from the west here. Now, again, you can argue this is an unnecessary dilution of force. Why are you squandering your forces on 4 different axes when actually you could hit with much more power on reduced axes? But there is actually a kind of logic to this, and this is again back to the poor roads. It's very, very hard actually to move sufficient logistic support even for these attacks. If you concentrate even more troops into one area, actually feeding them, supplying them becomes almost impossible, and particularly following them up and moving supplies forward as they advance. Recently, when I was writing about Leningrad, I got to the stage where Manstein's 11th Army was transferred up to the Leningrad area from Crimea. And many people have said this was a strategic disaster. They should have remained in the south where they would have been much more useful. But A, that's being kind of wise after the event. And B, if they had stayed in the south, given the logistic difficulties that the Wehrmacht had supplying Army Group South and Army Group A and B, would they actually have had the resources to feed and supply a whole extra army? So, boring old logistics, as has been demonstrated in the current fighting in Ukraine, logistics is dull as ditch water, but it is absolutely king. It dominates everything. So on this occasion, the Red Army attacks across the Vezuza River. Once again, we have a ferocious artillery battle, followed by this assault. And at first, the Red Army smashes into that small line of villages immediately across the Vezuza. But they can't take those, and most of those villages remain in German hands, and they become these ferocious little strong points, all within firing range of each other, all able to direct German artillery from the rear. And more to the point, they make it really, really difficult for the Soviets to move troops into, as Phil says, their salient within a salient. So here we have 2 exploitation groups, 6th Tank Corps and 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps. Dear old 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps has been in the thick of it all the way through this year, rebuilt several times over. 6th Tank Corps was sent into action. It bypassed the German strong points. It eventually reached that railway line at Lozhki. In doing so, it lost over half its tanks, just advancing over those 5 miles of ground, because those villages remained in German hands. How big an obstacle was the Vezuza? The Vezuza was a moderate-sized river, so you're talking about maybe the Thames in Oxfordshire. We're talking about a river maybe 30 meters across, maybe a little bit more. But the main problem with the Vezuza is steep banks and forested banks. So the river ice itself isn't so much a problem. It's actually getting access to the riverbanks that's the difficulty. And the Red Army finds it's impossible to move its artillery forward. So as forces probe down that salient, they're operating without artillery support.
And is it as they find it impossible to move forward, in your opinion, is that their failure or the Germans being good at the defensive, or a bit of both?
Well, it's of course it's a bit of both. They couldn't move forward through those fortified villages. Those had to be smashed first. But again, the inability of Soviet artillery, despite its manifest weight, to suppress those defenses was a consistent failure in this era of the Second World War. They just didn't have the precise targeting that they needed to kill those strong points.
And is that lack of forward observers, lack of radios and communication, just a lack of finesse?
Again, all of that finesse, that the stuff that Western armies, including the Germans, take for granted, being able to direct artillery fire with precision when you hit an obstacle, they just didn't have that. So
they're still going for kind of the blanket approach with lots of artillery.
Big
smothering rather than precision.
Yeah, big fire plan to start with, but after that, actually innovating and making stuff up as you go, they're not so good. Were they forced to try and capture bridgeheads? Well, they were trying to. They did build bridges. They had bridging units with bridging capability, and they were able to put up bridges. But of course, the Germans know where. They have excellent aerial reconnaissance, so they're able to spot wherever these bridges are, and they have very precise artillery. And any Royal Engineers officer I've worked with will tell you, it's everyone's nightmare trying to build a bridge when the other side can actually shell you almost.
And it's a recipe for disaster, having a salient like that goes over a river, so that you then got the problem of bringing up reinforcements over that river. You lose that crossing point, exactly. And it's maintain that crossing point open when, as you say, the Germans know exactly where it is. There's lots of reasons. Even the amateur military historian looking at that and going, "That's a really risky." If that goes well, it could be amazing. If it goes wrong, it can go very, very badly wrong very quickly.
And given the strengths and weaknesses of the two sides, you're going up against an army which at this stage of the war is probably the world expert at encounter battles and improvised warfare. You're kind of asking for trouble. So we're going to deal with this side of the salient before we move on and talk about the other fighting around here. Eventually, Second Guards Cavalry Corps was thrown into action. It suffered massive casualties, filtering past those fortified villages. Two of its divisions managed to link up with 6th Tank Corps at the very tip of the salient. Eventually, Western Front decided this was going nowhere. 6th Tank Corps was ordered to withdraw so that it could be re-equipped. About a quarter of the Tank Corps managed to make it out. Most of the cavalry were either destroyed or a small pocket managed to get out. One entire cavalry division was left trapped in the western part of that salient as they fell back. And eventually, the 900 survivors of this cavalry were ordered to abandon their heavy equipment and head west. So they're off on their own hike across the base of this salient, and we'll pick up with these guys later on. So if we press on here, here's a picture of typical fighting. The old Maxim gun that was a key of First World War fighting is still in widespread use. And yeah, much like the Vickers machine gun of the British, it has the virtue of being almost indestructible. This thing could sustain fire for very, very long periods. So it looks a bit rubbish, but it's a damned effective weapon, it just was in many ways epitomizes this fighting through these smashed forests and this constant fighting. David's question, partisan activity, there certainly wasn't in the salient because this whole salient was just stuffed full of German troops. There were some partisan groups operating, but it was actually very hard for them to achieve very much simply because there were so many German forces moving through here. If we move on to the next bit, so this is the northern sector where on the one hand you have 39th Army striking down from the north, and as you can see they gained a little bit of ground right at the top of this salient, an advance of maybe 5 miles. Rather more impressive was the advance down the Lecheza Valley from the northwest on the left-hand side of this map. And Katukov at this point was commander of 3rd Mechanized Corps, and he chewed up several battle groups from Großdeutschland during the fighting here, and eventually he managed to reach this sort of salient projecting into the Rzhev salient. But it's going nowhere. It's not like they were gaining anything important. Had they been able to push on a little bit further and reach that road running north-south to Olenino, that might have had some strategic value. But on its own, this salient was going nowhere. And again, we're fighting in terribly forested and difficult country. This was not really going to be a recipe for success. So let's crack on because the time is getting,
and we're fully in the hard winter now. So
this is now December 42. 6th Army is now surrounded in Stalingrad. You have Manstein taking over command of Army Group B. He's trying to mount Winter Storm to try to break through to Stalingrad. The whole of the Don front is gradually collapsing. And meanwhile, Zhukov is still chewing away at this salient, trying to turn this this battle into some sort of victory. So
Does it get to a point with Zhukov where, in your interpretation, he should have walked away from this, but there becomes an element of hubris and just pride and kind of, I'm in for a penny now, in for doubling down, that modern way of politicians doubling down now, until just keep on going until I get a victory, however, at whatever cost.
I think that's exactly it. And one of the adjectives that is constantly applied to Zhukov is stubborn. And, being stubborn when you're fighting a defensive battle is a good thing. Being stubborn in an offensive operation, not so good, particularly in this sort of fighting. And he is so committed. I've got to destroy this salient to rescue my reputation, to make sense of the enormous sacrifice before.
With the way the Soviet army works, Prit, okay, he's a high-ranking officer who's kind of going to come out of this war very, very much in vogue. But given that Stalin is your boss, you can only kind of fuck up once in the Red Army, can't you? So,
to a point,
pulling away from this is an admission of failure, isn't it?
Well, yes, except by now, even Stalin has realized you're going to have to win the war with what you've got. Right. You can't carry on shooting generals. You're kind of running out, so you're going to have to. If you go, to go back a couple of questions. Yes, this is a German 75 mil pack that was captured by the Red Army and was being used. Hence, you're quite right. That is an AP round that the guy is carrying. But these are Soviet gunners with a captured weapon. Both sides made extensive use of captured weapons. You used what you could grab, really. And you're quite right. The ground is frozen hard by now. You can't really dig in. And that applies to both sides. Because as we go on to the next map now, this is the attack directly opposite the attack on by Western Front that we've already talked about, where those fortified villages held up the Soviets. This attack looks really quite impressive. You have this big advance where Solomartin's 1st Mechanized Corps managed to push all the way through to the Nacha River. In its wake, you can see here the 6th Stalin Volunteer Rifle Corps. Terrible time these guys had. These were so-called volunteers from the prison camps in Siberia. Just how much they volunteered? Well, perhaps they did volunteer because it was that or stay in the prison camps. When they were sent to the front line, because of shortages of railway transport, they were dropped 115 miles from the front line and had to make the final approach on foot. As they made the approach on foot, nobody had provided for them. They had no rations. There were no supply dumps for them. Several of the soldiers starved to death on their approach march. By the time they reached the front line, they had to receive supplementary rations just to restore them to physical strength for the operation. Nonetheless, they broke the German line. And why did they break the line? Someone has already mentioned this. You will see on the left-hand side of the map, the 2nd Luftwaffe Field Division. These wonderfully incompetent inventions of Hermann Goering. 2nd Luftwaffe Field Division was utterly smashed in the initial breakthrough. 1st Mechanized Corps then exploited, but Belly and these villages immediately to the south remained in German hands, and there was ferocious, constant attritional fighting around there. You have elements of Großdeutschland, 1st Panzer Division, all holding those lines together with the infantry of 246th Infantry Division. And increasingly, 41st Army was diverting its 2nd echelon to try to crush Belly and capture that. But they couldn't. And in the meantime, Solomartin had pushed on to the east as he'd been asked to do, and he was saying, "Look, I'm more and more exposed here. I'm running out of options." Meanwhile, the Germans are doing what the Germans do. They're moving forces into position for a counterattack. 30th Corps headquarters arrives from the north. This was originally part of Manstein's 11th Army in Crimea. It had then been sent to the Leningrad sector, and now Corps headquarters under Frete-Pico comes to this sector. Eventually, Frete-Pico is going to end up fighting in eastern Ukraine. He has at his disposal an SS Cavalry Division and 19th and 20th Panzers, plus 12th Panzer Division, which is now deploying along that highway you can see running from the bottom right-hand corner all the way up to Belly. Did 2nd Luftwaffe Division have heavy equipment? They did have some artillery. Some of it was former Luftwaffe flak units, but they did have some heavy artillery, not as much as a regular infantry division would have had. But hey, they had what they had, and they certainly, like all Luftwaffe field divisions at this time, they were smashed up pretty badly. Anyway, the Germans now counterattacked from the south. Those panzer divisions and the SS cavalry advanced. On the first day of their counterattack, they covered most of the ground to the German lines near Belly. It then took them 4 days to cover the last mile, and Solomartin's mechanized corps was isolated together with a good part of the poor old Siberians of 6th Rifle Corps, the so-called volunteers. Eventually, Solomartin and the Rifle Corps managed to break out to the west and escaped. The Germans then moved their panzers further north to try to destroy that other penetration on the northwest side of the salient. That didn't go so well, and in the end, the battle lines then froze. So as Mars grinds to a halt, this is where we are. Someone's commented, SS cavalry more suited to anti-partisan tasks. Well, that's certainly what they were used for, and they had a terrible reputation. Their so-called anti-partisan tasks really involved sweeping through the countryside, killing pretty much everybody they met. But in this dense forested country, quite hilly, lots of ravines, frozen rivers, actually their horses gave them considerable mobility, and they were quite valuable. The final act of Mars is that little group of 900 cavalry who had got isolated coming from the other side. Sometime in January, they finally reached this sector that we're looking at now. And 41st Army mounted a diversionary attack from the northwest in order to break through to them. And those cavalrymen of 20th Cavalry Division were able to escape. So that was Mars. Again, here's the aftermath. Model's 9th Army lost another 45,000 men. Another staggering loss. Red Army's losses in Mars came to over 300,000. It is just absolutely, jaw-dropping. And yet, even as the battle was winding down, Zhukov, unremarkably, is drawing up plans for another operation against this salient. He is still determined to crush the salient. But instead, if we move on to the next map,
there we go. Yep.
Do we have this map? Yeah. So this was Operation Buffel, which took place in March 1943. And this was Model's phased withdrawal all the way back towards Smolensk. This was in preparation for the Battle of Kursk, and it was to shorten the lines in order to release forces. And on this occasion, the Germans were allowed basically to conduct this withdrawal at their own leisure. The Red Army made very little attempt to pin them down and hold them, and they just basically followed them across the salient, and did nothing to pin them down. So, having defended this salient all the way through 1942, having dealt with two major offensives in the summer and the winter, 9th Army then abandons the salient on its own terms. And, in terms of a defensive operation, this is how, they walk out heads held high. We did our job, we slaughtered the enemy, and we're leaving on our own terms.
But you can see in the post-war narrative and the Zhukov and the rewriting and the Stalin, how without any knowledge of what you've just been taking us through over the last hour, if you base this purely on where the map was for the Red Army in July 42 and where it was in March 43, the Germans have been pushed back, quote unquote, a considerable number of miles. So you can, there's enough of a movement there to frame this in such a way is that you can tell your own people, hey, look, we've had this victory, we pushed the Germans back this number of miles. The fact, as you said, the Germans pulled back on their own terms and it was held high with the majority of their equipment is beside the point. Within the way the Russian or Soviet propaganda system works, it's understandable why this can be sold whatever way you want to sell it.
and the way they sold it and the way they played, particularly Mars, was that this was essential because without this, Uranus and little Saturn would not have succeeded. This tied down enormous Soviet resources, German resources in Army Group Center. And let's face it, that's a lot of panzer divisions we've already described in this action. Well, what might they have done south, in the south? But on the other hand, if this hadn't taken place and those panzer divisions had been able to go south, so too would 300,000 Soviet soldiers who died here. So, this was, whichever way you look at it, I have to say, I back David Glantz's view. This was an utter disaster. It served no real purpose. And this memorial stands near Rzhev. I planned to visit this April. I had plans all organized. I had organized a hotel to stay in Moscow. The hotel was going to provide me with a car and a translator and a driver to take me to the Rzhev Salient. Only events intervened.
Yes.
This memorial was opened just before COVID hit. Until then, there was no memorial to the fighting in Rzhev. The summer fighting had been largely airbrushed out of Soviet historical accounts. The winter fighting was portrayed as an essential to what happened in the south, and yet, of all of the battles fought by the Red Army, the fighting around the Rzhev Salient probably resulted in more poetry than any other battle. And these poems became very well known in parts of the Soviet Union in the Cold War years and the years that follow. And they finished, what's the significance of the swans? They're storks, because the area was full of the marshes where the storks would nest. And in fact, storks are very common all the way across Eastern Europe. If you travel through the Baltic region and Poland, it's considered good luck to have storks nesting on your property. So they create storks' nests on the top of lampposts and telegraph posts in order to encourage them to nest there. But I finished my Rzhev book with a couple of lines of poetry from a poem called Kropotova, which is one of the villages on the west side of the salient, I beg your pardon, on the east side of the salient, that disappeared in the terrible summer fighting. This is Kropotova near Rzhev. You turn left from the road. There were no more than 20 houses there. I don't know how much is left. In the vast Russian land, that village is like a deep wound through the chest. And was there no medal for Kropotova? No, no medals were given for it. And probably the combine harvests the rye, or the tractor turns the soil. And they all pass freely over the front lines. And they don't know, and they don't hear, and they don't smell. And now the Vazouza River, the scene of such terrible fighting, it was dammed in the 1960s to create a reservoir. So a lot of these battlefields and a lot of the mass graves are now lost under that reservoir. Literally dozens of corpses and remains are still found every year by people trekking through the forests and exploring them. So many men of both sides have no known resting place in this utterly attritional battle that had so much more in common with the fighting of the previous war than it did with.
Well, that's been one of the comments in the sidebar. This sounds like the Ypres salient. It sounds like or even the Russian front in the First World War. It's just got a different flavor, a different sense to it than the more famous Stalingrad front that has all the opportunity for these epic. We're going to have Ian McGregor on in December and talking about Pavlov's house and all this. There are these opportunities for mythologizing to come out of Stalingrad on both sides in some ways, but certainly on the Soviet side. But this battle, except what David's saying there, that Zhukov obviously did enough in this to not, blot his copybook with Stalin. And again, is this how much of this is how he related what happened in the way he wanted to explain it?
Yes.
But it is fascinating.
You just have thinking that if anyone other than Zhukov would not have survived this, and if Zhukov had done this maybe a year before, he probably wouldn't have survived this. But by then, he'd established enough of a reputation as the savior of Moscow, etc., that he was able to survive this. He was able to steal a lot of the glory of Stalingrad, which actually should have gone to Vasilevsky, who was overseeing operations down there. And yet Zhukov is seen as the great champion, largely because Vasilevsky was a really nice guy and just didn't actually bang his own drum too much.
Which Zhukov was the typical of a person who the cliche of making sure he comes out of history well, because he'll tell it himself in his way with his team, and the propaganda team behind him was sufficient, and he came out of it with Stalin's support, praise, backing, whatever you want to call it.
Exactly. So Benjamin Allen's comment there, you might think that Putin wouldn't allow such a monument to be erected. When the monument was unveiled, Putin gave a speech there, and I'm not going to read out the whole speech because it goes on a bit, but he says, not so long ago, the battles near Rzhev were hardly ever mentioned in official historical sources. Participants had written just a few scarce words. It was too difficult to remember that terrible Rzhev meat grinder, as it is sometimes called. It's impossible to think about the Red Army's losses in those battles without pain. And he goes on to say more than 1.3 million people were killed, injured, or recorded as missing. So that includes the winter fighting too.
Good grief.
And then he goes on to say the significance of that long and bloody victory. He still calls it a victory. Of that long and bloody victory, for the victory of the Soviet people over Nazism is huge. The Soviet army finally demonstrated that the enemy would not be able to turn and advance towards Moscow once more. So yet again, you're distorting the historical record.
Yeah, it started off well, quite well, and then at the end you turn it around in such a way as you've sold it.
Because this is something that Western powers, and I think particularly Britain and France, have done probably better than any other nation, the ability to remember the Somme or Verdun or Ypres with a tremendous sense of sorrow and loss, but without failing to recognize the senselessness of the enormous losses. Whereas even now, all these years later, clearly in the Russian mindset, that is still something that can't be done.
They've managed to always retain that element of it being, as you say, a victory, a great patriotic achievement, and somehow that sits on the scales from their point of view and balances against the tragedy. Whereas you're right, from the British and French with Verdun, we don't let the tragic element overshadow the potential gains out of it, I guess.
And I'm also left, we now know that it's no coincidence that Putin really did glorify the achievements of the Soviet Union and the Red Army in the lead up to what is now unfolding. And one wonders how much of that has, was even in 2019 when this memorial was being unveiled. One wonders how much of that was also playing a part in his thinking. Again, it's easy to reinterpret those events with the hindsight of today.
Well, we'll bring things to end. We just have one question from Andreas asking you: are you planning any new books about the First World War?
Andreas, no, I'm not. I have been invited to collaborate with another author on books about cavalry in the First World War, covering several fronts, and also perhaps looking at the campaigns in North Italy. I am actually encouraging the other person involved to do the writing themselves, because it's clearly very much his area of interest, and I look forward very much to helping him and contributing to his books. But I think it should be his baby, and I want him to take absolute credit for seeing those projects through.
Well, that's well put. But we will enjoy your future writings about World War II, and we hope we will come back and explain more about them on World War II TV. I'll just take you off screen for a second and remind people what's coming up tomorrow. So tomorrow, a double bill for you tomorrow. So 10 a.m. UK time, Nigel Askey is coming on to do the first of two parts about Soviet losses during Operation Barbarossa. So we're going back 12 months, 18 months or so. So if you haven't seen Nigel's incredible Barbarossa.net website, it's going to be very, very data heavy. But for those of you who like data and graphs and statistics, it's all about that, because Nigel's former background was in IT and storage and management and processing of data. So it's about the data aspect of Barbarossa. And then an extra show for you tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. UK time. Waitman Bjorn is coming on for the kind of dark and tragic story of the Wehrmacht invading Belarus and the atrocities inflicted by them against the population of Belarus. So Waitman is coming on to do that. I just listed that one today. Then another on Wednesday, Nigel is back for the second part of the Barbarossa show. We've got one. Stephen Ossad is coming back. You remember we had to delay his show about Bradley in Operation Cobra because of internet problems. Well, hopefully they're resolved. He'll be back Wednesday night. Then Thursday, Wendy Goldman is coming on to talk about the Soviet civilians and how they were able to move their factories back out of the way of the advancing Germans and do all that side. So we haven't done anything about the Russian people, the civilians, yet. So I'm looking forward to that on Thursday, and that's what's coming up. So I'm going to bring Prit back on just to say good evening. A masterclass, the superlatives coming out saying how about you are as expected. Lots of great descriptions of your presentation style. So people love you there and say, and obviously, folks, I hold up the book again. You've only given us an absolute greatest hits package of what there is in the book. There are way more of the human interest aspect, way more sources of diary. So I recommend you get out and get the book there. Is it actually available to buy? I got my copy in the pub. Is it available to buy?
Not yet. It's officially released in October.
Right.
However, with your permission, Woody, I'm very happy to give away a copy to one of your listeners, but I will leave you to work out how they can compete or bid for it. But if you pass on details to me, I'll be very happy then.
Thank you. We will do something where we do a thing, and I'll do a draw or something. Thank you very much, Prit. We'll do that. So yeah, but it's available pre-order anyway. So on your favorite website or whatever, or your local bookstore. But as it'll stand alongside other ones as being a classic read.
And David Kay's comment there. Yes, the photos are from the book. Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, there we are then, folks. So this is Paul Woodadge and Prit Buttar for World War II TV. I will see you all again tomorrow for the two shows. So thanks everybody for watching. That was absolutely brilliant. Cheers. Bye. Good evening.